Welcome to this chess video. You've probably heard Ben Feingold say never play f3. I can understand where that comes from, very beginner minded, and dealing with absolutes like never or always. I'm sure the intermediate to advanced chess player knows that there are very rarely absolutes in chess. As Levi Rosman likes to say, it depends. And so in this video we're going to talk about some of the cases where playing the move f3 as white or f6 for black might actually be justified. So think of never play f3 as more of a guideline and not an absolute. Let's get into some of those exceptions so you can start thinking for yourself, is this a move that actually makes sense in that position? Now before we get to this famous game here, and other examples that I'll show, we have to go to pawn structure. And so for that I have to go a little bit of review into home pawns and the importance of keeping those pawns close to your castled king. Here we're not going to do an entire repeat of that, we're just going to focus specifically on playing pawn to f3 and the weaknesses that come with it. So the very first thing I have to address, what is a home pawn? So whenever you castle, these are the pawns right in front of your king. So in this case, these are white's home pawns here, right in front of white's castled king, and for black it would be these three pawns here. Now if we take a position like this, where some side castles queenside, then these three are still the home pawns. Even though this a pawn isn't really touching the king, very often the king is going to want to go to b8 for safety. And same thing for white, where for white, if they castle queenside, these will be their home pawns. Now generally speaking, you want to keep your home pawns close to your king, because this is what offers you shelter from checks, and most dangerously checkmate. As the game gets closer to an endgame, more pieces are traded off, you don't have to worry about pesky attacks from the queen, bishops, and lots of other pieces that can do a lot of damage, especially on the diagonals. The reason I mention those pieces specifically is because when we play pawn to f3, the move that Feingold talks poorly about, he has very good reason to, because very often you've now weakened yourself on these entire diagonals, and we can see that this usually ends up attacking our king. Just imagine if black were to play their queen from d8, in some position get it to b6, that's a check to the king, and now they might pick up a piece or pawn on b2. Also very common is black will oftentimes play a bishop to c5, and that has a very similar idea where this in-between idea might be very dangerous to white's king. It's just a good guideline to avoid pushing f3, but the intermediate and more advanced player will understand the nuances and realize when it is actually safe or even mandatory to start pushing the pawns in front of your king for safety. Now I just want to comment another thing that is weak with pawn to f3. Also notice that this pawn used to be controlling these two squares here. And so when this pawn actually advances to f3, well, in the process of doing so, it's now controlling squares further up, yes, but the drawback to this is that these squares here that I'll put in red now have less influence because the pawn cannot go back. And so by default, if I get rid of the yellow arrows here, that actually makes these squares highlighted in red actually weaker just because this pawn has advanced to f3. And notice that this is actually compounded even worse when you play pawn to f4, because now look at the weak squares that we've left simply because we've advanced this pawn up to f4. So these squares highlighted in red are now potentially much weaker because they cannot be defended by this f-pawn. So when does it of course make sense to play f3? Because here we want to get to the specifics and not just generalities. And so that's what brings us to this first example here. This game that I alluded to with Garry Kasparov. And this is actually opening theory. Many grandmasters have played this exact position, so I'll kind of breeze through the moves very briefly, because again, I don't want to focus this video to be the opening, but I do want to go through the moves quickly, just so you can see how we get to this position. All of this is the Queen's Gambit, very common moves that are played here. And now, although not the only way to play this position, you could of course play moves like Rook A to E1, try and support Pawn to E4, things like that, good alternatives. But one move I like a lot, and is opening theory, is of course pawn to f3. In this case, this actually makes sense. So let's put it on the board and try and explain why you would want to play this. So we do play the book move, pawn to f3. And now you'll realize that, as we've mentioned earlier, whenever you play pawn to f3, you are weak on these diagonals. And more specifically, you are usually weak on these squares. In this case, the e3 pawn is actually under some serious pressure, and if this pawn stays here too long, this rook is going to be very annoying and possibly win this pawn. But in opening theory, what happens very often in this line is this bishop will actually retreat back to h4, and then if this knight ever moves, offering some kind of bishop trade, this bishop wants to retreat, and it'll actually come back harmoniously to f2, with the sole purpose of guarding e3, preparing pawn to e4, and then aggressively playing in the center. And the real silent genius of this bishop to f2 move is that the bishop from f2, unlike the bishop being on g5, is also adding support to d4. Because the bishop here is adding this, and why is d4 important? d4 is important because when this pawn advances from e3 to e4, fixing the weakness that it had on e3, now the d4 pawn is a little bit lagging behind, and c5 is a very dangerous threat that black can try and play to equalize. And of course from there, the bishop on f2 also attacks this square, while defending d4. So it's a lot more advanced positional things, but of course I wouldn't expect anything less from Garry Kasparov and a lot of other top grandmasters who've played this. In fact, it was Mikhail Botvinnik who really invented this f3 idea in the Queen's Gambit Declined. But I do want to mention one other detail that is actually fairly important a lot of times when you play pawn to f3 as white or pawn to f6 as black. And that is the fact that in many of these positions, the center will be somewhat closed. Remember that the biggest danger I mentioned was a queen potentially getting to b6 or a bishop coming to c5, possibly with checks or dangerous pressure on this king. But notice that both of those moves here aren't as big of a threat because we have this pawn on d4. And in this case, even a pawn on e3, which kind of helps shield the diagonal for this king. So in a sense, this diagonal is fairly closed. Now granted, this is not permanent, and maybe it might be a good idea for white to long-term play an idea like king to h1, just to be a little bit safer. But for the time being, the king is justified in staying here, and it is safe enough. Now again, this is a judgment call. We're not going to play f3 just for the sake of playing it, because there are weaknesses that come with it. But if there's enough positive to outbalance the negative, it might be worth playing. Now let's go to another opening theory example here. This is actually a line from the Alekhine's defense. Once again, it's opening theory, so I'll breeze through the moves kind of quickly. The idea with this opening is black is spending a lot of knight moves, but they're provoking white into advancing their pawns and grabbing the center, so black can actually target the center long term. So I'll breeze through the moves here kind of quickly. Again, opening theory, not the focus of this video, but I want to get us to the critical position. And that position is here, where both sides have castled, development looks really smooth for both players, and as long as both sides get their queen off the back rank, then both sides will be fully developed in pieces. And so one justifiable move for black could actually just be queen to d7. That's a fine move. If you were a beginner to intermediate player, by all means you could play it and you would have a very playable position. But I think the more advanced player, or at least the more astute player to playing f3 or f6, might realize that here is a really good possibility to be advancing your f-pawn. In this case, pawn to f6 is not only the best move according to the engine, but it's also the most common move at the Grandmaster level. This move is opening theory, and so f6 makes a ton of sense here. Now let's unpack, why is f6 the good idea? Well, let me go back a little bit here. Remember that I said white has grabbed the center, because black has allowed them to by playing all of those knight moves and provoking white forward. That's a much more advanced concept called a hypermodern opening. I made a video on that if you want to check that out as well. But for the time being, at least understand that this was intentional by black, and now black has to use pawn breaks to fight and try and break down the white center. And so what are the main pawn breaks here? Well, from a pawn structure perspective, this center needs to be attacked, and we can attack it with either pawn c5 or pawn to f6. And you'll see that one of these is possible and one of these is not. Of course, the one that's not possible is the c5, because the knight is actually sitting here on c6. So by default, really the only possible pawn break you can play, but also an adequate one, is pawn to f6. And opening theory would continue usually by white capturing and allowing bishop captures back. Now again, opening theory is not the focus of this video, but I do want to show how weak is the black king. Okay, sure, we have advanced the f-pawn, but notice that this diagonal is somewhat closed, at least in the respect that white can't really easily get a bishop here or a queen here and deliver some kind of check against the king, or even really pressure to do so. Now I know it's really not the best move, but just for argument's sake, let's say they try and put a queen on b3 and put a lot of pressure here. Well, in this case, notice that by misplacing their queen, trying to attack the king, it gives white the opportunity to attack the center. And in this case, actually win material doing so. They can just capture on d4. And if things do get traded, although objectively not best, you can see that black has enough pieces to help defend this square. And this also comes with check. The reason I play out this line is to highlight the fact that white has advanced their f-pawn. And very similar to what we were talking about, there could be pressure on this diagonal against this king as well. It's good to see these patterns from both sides, where both white and black can be weak from playing f3 or f6. But by no means does this say that you should never play it. Again, back here, pawn to f6 is opening theory, and Grandmaster approved. So don't get locked into thinking absolutes and never playing something, when very often it might be what you have to play. And now I have another example. This one is really interesting. This one is from the King's Indian Defense. Play the main line here. Again, I'll breeze through the moves kind of quickly. Normal variation is knight to f3. I just want to comment that one main line is actually the same-ish variation, pawn f3, and we're actually playing f3 very early. So again, playable, and even though you are weak on these diagonals here, there is justification in playing this. But the same-ish is not the focus of this example. Showing the main line here with knight to f3, the normal variation. Play some more opening theory. Continuing to develop and control the center. And now in this position, what move would you guess is opening theory and the top engine move? You've probably caught on to the theme of this video. It is indeed playing pawn to f3. And I think this move might baffle a lot of beginners, because if we go back here, you might look at this position and go, well, why not just play a move like bishop to f3? Or perhaps a move like queen to d2. And although both of those moves are improving your development, and objectively fine moves, pawn f3 is actually a smidge stronger. With pawn to f3, we're helping to reinforce the very needed center, which is definitely under attack. This knight and rook, possibly even the queen adding more pressure. And so f3 makes a lot of sense. Additionally, by controlling these squares, we are keeping this knight restricted, especially coming to g4, as is common in many of these lines. So f3 has some good benefits here. But what are the drawbacks? Well, once again, the diagonals tend to be the biggest problem. Put these on the board here, and again, it's also the fact that we have these squares specifically weak from advancing this pawn to f3. But are these squares a weakness right now? The center isn't really as closed. If we notice on this diagonal, there are no pawns to help shield the king. What white does have is this really amazing bishop helping defend those dark squares. And it is the presence of this bishop that makes playing f3 justifiable in this case. And this is actually the reason why this bishop is oftentimes best on e3 in this opening. If you were to play a developing bishop to g5, or even bishop to f4 in some of these opening lines, you'll notice in those variations, white will be a little bit more careful about advancing their f-pawn. And so that's it. That's basically the secret with f3 and f6. Although it is definitely a weakening move, you shouldn't be thinking of absolutes and never playing something. It is a good guideline, but when you understand pawn structure and king safety a little bit more, then you'll start making the judgment call for yourself on whether playing f3 or f6 is actually a good move or not. And by no means will you get this 100% correct. This is a learning process. But if you never take risks and never play those moves, then you'll never learn from the mistakes of when you do play it, and you'll miss out on the brilliant opportunities where that move actually turns out to be best. And through trial and error of trying over and over, eventually you'll start to get a feel for which positions this is enough benefit, and which positions it is not. Sometimes you do have to advance those pawns, including pawn to f3 or even f4. And very similar with black, you'll see in some openings them play pawn to f6 or pawn to f5. So stay a little more open-minded. I hope this video helped clarify some of this for you, and I'll see you in the next chess video.